It's a pleasure to be here today talking to all of you. I apologize once again. These talks seem to be bad luck for me because whenever I have to give one, I have a cold. So please bear with me and we'll get through this all. So I see a lot of familiar faces, so if you can help me, how many people have attended one of the Digital Archives talks already? And how many of you haven't? And how many of you just aren't voting? So we do have a lot of new faces, which is great because we are going to set this up by talking about a little bit about the project history. So those of you who are not familiar with it, we'll bring you up to speed. And those of you who haven't heard from us in almost a year, this will be a good refresher for you to help set the groundwork for what it is that we're doing. We're then going to go back to the archives plan, which was part of the initial development phase, and talk about some of the recommendations that were made in that plan and where we are with those recommendations today. We'll talk a little bit about the Open Archival Information Systems standard. It's an ISO standard that covers digital preservation and how we are using that to build the system here so that we know the preservation system that is being built is following best practices and is really leveraging off of the experience of brighter minds than us. We're also going to talk about where we are with some of our partners that are participating in the prototype, and then talk about what's coming next and where your agencies and your partnerships can help play off of that and build. So let's talk a little bit about the project history. So there are some very strong laws in Hawaii that clearly show that records created or received in the usual and ordinary course of business have to be cared for and managed. So we can start with the definition of a government record is any information maintained by an agency in written, auditory, visual, electronic, or other physical form. So that's a record. If we go on, we also have a statute that covers the disposal of government records, in which the comptroller gets to determine how these records will be disposed of. And in turn, the comptroller has appointed the state archivist to make recommendations on the requests for disposal and the actions that need to be taken for those records. That means that anything that fits the definition of record has to be on an approved retention schedule before you can destroy it. Because there are legal, historical, and fiscal issues, value in those records that we must protect and ensure that they are kept for the amount of time that they are necessary to fulfill those obligations. So we also have some public record laws that a public record is any writing, memorandum, entry, print, representation, report, book, paper, map, plan, or combination thereof that is in the custody of a department or agency of government. It's very important that we understand this. Public record. I'm sure you've all heard of public disclosure laws. This is part of where it stems from. And then we also, Act 177 in 2005, allows for the creation, use, and storage of government records in an electronic format. So that it is allowing for not only born digital records, but also the conversion of paper to electronic to be used as records in an electronic form, which means we can then start to manage them electronically. Because as you all know, and I'm sure have experienced, paper can be very difficult to have to manage. It's very bulky, time-consuming, only one person can use it at the same time. When your filing cabinet gets full, what do? We have some solutions. We have some answers that we can make it more manageable and more accessible. And actually, in my opinion, as an archives geek, we can protect it much better in an electronic format than we ever could in paper. So, building on that, we have the mission of the state archives. And it's really to foster open government by preserving and making accessible to the public the historic records of the state government. So all of those public records, all of those government records that have been determined by the comptroller and on an approved retention schedule as permanent should be going to the state archives so that the state archives can preserve these records in perpetuity for the public to benefit from the actions that we have taken, to learn from the lessons of what we have done, to not repeat the mistakes that we have made, or to build off of the successes that we have created in our course of business. And we do this by partnering with the agencies to really help manage their active and inactive records. We have a records center and records management to help deal with the inactive records, what happens between the time that, well, you've created it and you don't quite know what to do with it, but you can't quite get rid of it right now, all the way through to the you're done with it, you've created it, it's a permanent record that has to be kept forever, in perpetuity. What do you do? That's what we help out with. Because particularly with electronic records, that is a very difficult proposition. Now, have any of you used a 3.5-inch floppy disk in your day and age and time? Where are all those 3.5-inch floppies? Does anybody actually have one on their desktop right now? What about WordStar? Remember that? What happened to all the records we created in WordStar? These are important public records of permanent value, potentially. What do we do with them? So we have to be more proactive in dealing with these electronic records than with paper. Because paper you can put aside for 50 years, forget about it, stumble across it, and go, oh, I have paper. If we wait on electronic records for 50 years, we're going to be stuck with laser discs. 8-inch floppies. Anybody use any of those? What do we do with those 50 years from now? If we could even read the media, because it's electronic, it kind of like self-destructs itself after a certain period of time. So we have to be more proactive. By providing some value-added services from our information management expertise to help you better manage those records in the more global sense. So with that in mind, we have set a goal for the digital archives. And that is to preserve digital records of enduring legal, historical, or fiscal value, and to protect those records from loss, alteration, deterioration, and technological obsolescence, while maintaining them in a trustworthy state. And I think that is a very critical component. As Susan mentioned, I'm working on a PhD at the University of British Columbia. My particular focus is on authenticity of digital records. Because if you do not have authentic digital records, you have data. They aren't records. From a legal perspective, you cannot use them in a court of law if you cannot establish their authenticity, their opinions, and therefore hearsay. So we need to do this with a particular eye towards how do we preserve these in perpetuity, which is a very long time, while maintaining their authenticity. And we're going to do that by partnering with agencies to reduce your burden for managing your inactive digital records, and make those records that are accessible and disclosable to the public accessible 24/7 by 365. As Susan mentioned, I did this in Washington State, and we had an average of 750 researchers a day coming to the website. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365. It's a very empowering experience from a transparency of government perspective when you can put that information out and available to researchers to be able to search when they need it, how they need it, being able to surf the web at 2 o'clock in the morning in your pajamas to find your historic records and check, you know, what's my government doing for me today? It's a very great experience. So how are we going to do this? We're going to create partnerships, and we've already started to do that and have some very great partners that are helping us develop this prototype system so that we can remove the responsibility of having to manage the digital records from them and move it onto the archives, because we are trained information management professionals. That's what we do. That's what we love, is to preserve this history that is being created today and make it accessible in the future. So that we can also help ensure that records that must be kept according to a retention schedule are kept and are accessible. Because somebody has to make sure that these public records, if a public disclosure request comes in, can be found and can be viewed. So if you have those WordStar documents, you gotta love technology. So, and we're going to do this by creating an environment that really encourages information management. And we're really wanting to do this from a womb to tomb type of perspective. Providing a brief interlude. It's all good. And so we're working with OAMT to really figure out in the new world, how do we do this so that we can make the management aspect easier for you, the records creators, and those that have to manage these records in an agency perspective. Because it's a very difficult thing to do, and if we don't do it right now, it's going to be very difficult to correct after the fact. Because again, we'll be stuck with the 3.5-inch floppies, we'll be stuck with WordStar, we'll be stuck with CDs that we have no idea what to do with, or even have the software to read what is on there. So we're going to do this by creating policies that will help create and manage the technology and the record-keeping practices within each agency to give you those guidelines to help you better manage what you have. By creating some standards within the state that really focus on the record creation and maintenance process. By providing guidelines to create and monitor those issues that will guide the implementation of these standards. Creating the technological infrastructure, the actual digital archives, and also the support of the new systems that are going in state government and how they can feed those records in a more automated process to the digital archives. So if you create a record, is there a way that we can embed the retention into that record at creation so that you don't really have to do anything? So that the record itself knows, hey, I can be destroyed after 3 years, but not until 3 years. Or, hey, I'm permanent. I need to go to the digital archives, and be able to negotiate that automatically so that record can be sent over as soon as it's created. And then finally, create the series of procedures that will help you implement some of these requirements, to build best practices and work with target agencies to say, this is how it can be done. Find those out there that are feeling the pain of this and say, hey, we really need help. We're willing to help you model this, and use them so that we can learn and grow and build the documentation to help the other agencies move forward. So part of our analysis of are we ready, do we need this in the state of Hawaii, we conducted a survey in October of 2010. Now, did anybody here participate in that survey? So a few of you, and we really appreciate that because that helped us a lot. We had 23 agencies respond and 77 individuals overall. So it was a series of 37 questions grouped into 4 different areas, so talking about general digital record issues, digital imaging, so the conversion of paper to electronic data management systems, so how do you manage your born digital content, and then finally just general records questions about the concept of what is a record. And so based on that, we found out that 86% really had no master plan for dealing with electronic records. 61% use CDs to store their records, which to me is very scary. Because CDs are great for moving stuff, but they don't last very long. And how long before that technology gets obsoleted? 20% don't know if their records are being backed up. 60% don't manage their email, which are public records. Besides, after 60 days, they all go away anyway, so we don't have to worry about it too much. 32% don't know if electronic records are on a retention schedule, and 8% don't even know if they have a migration, only 8% know if they have a migration plan for this data moving forward. So what happens as technology changes? Are we ready to help move those records forward? So based on all of that, we made a series of recommendations in the archive plan dealing with the staffing that would be necessary for the digital archives, the equipment that we would need to run this, the architecture and the software that would drive the whole process, and then also some legislative updates to really give some importance to the digital archive and some of the funding necessary to support this project moving forward. Because this is really a new initiative in the state archives. Dealing with this whole digital side of things, the archives doesn't have any budget for the technology side. It's really a brave new frontier. So how do we pay for all of this? The initial time frame had the prototype phase starting in June of 2012, or July 1st of 2012. Unfortunately, the way the budget was released, with money being released in quarterly increments, we had a late start. We weren't able to start until October 1st. And of a bigger stumbling block was actually hiring the staff, because we need technical staff to help build this system. The skill set did not exist in the state archives because we are information managers, not computer scientists. So with the late start for the project, it also really pushed recruitment back quite a bit, because it was originally supposed to be a temporary 12-month position. It got moved down to an 8-month position, and how many people really want to work for just 8 months and then have to find a new job? So it was difficult, but we did finally recruit all of our positions and had them on board by February 1st. So the next phase of the project, we were thinking about starting about now. Unfortunately, that's looking more toward July. And then again, also finally production going into full mode is we're looking at, you know, June of 2014 to be able to take anything in from anybody. So talking about staffing. So the initial recommendation was to hire dedicated staff with knowledge and experience in computer-based systems, and to be hired specifically and assigned to the Digital Archives project. So where are we? We've hired Todd Bloom as a systems developer. He has almost 30 years of development experience and is really bringing a great knowledge base to us. And then we also hired Donji Agnier as our acquisition specialist, young hotshot right out of college, and is really starting to groove on this whole archives concept, preserving history. And so he's really helping us out quite a bit in some of the research and development aspects. And then there was also the recommendation that we enter into a partnership with both Hawaii Pacific University and the University of Hawaii at Manoa to bring in some of their students as interns. It's an initiative that I started in Washington State and was very successful with bringing interns in. In fact, half the staff that I eventually hired started out as interns. And so we're bringing in some of their best and brightest. And we have 4 interns working for us right now, and we didn't plan it this way, but it winds up being 2 HPU students and 2 UH students, so we've kind of got a little inter-school rivalry thing going. And they're really helping us out by doing some research. What type of infrastructure are we going to use? What type of persistent identifier schema are we going to go with? And so we can assign them little research tasks, and they go out, see what's out there, what other people are doing, and report back and make some recommendations. So we have here Abe, Micah, and Calvin, who are doing most of the software development. And then we have Daniel, who is actually a master's student at HPU and is already A+ and Network Plus certified. So we actually worked in a data center doing desktop and server level support. So he's actually setting up and monitoring our server. So we were very, very fortunate in the quality of interns that we were able to hire. So from an equipment update, initially we recommended that we were going to have a single server in a virtualized environment with an attached storage array and a couple different types of technology options to move data from you to us. And what we actually wound up doing is almost exactly that, but talking with our partners and negotiating it more, we've added more different types of options of ways of getting data from the agencies to the archives. Because the one thing we want to make sure is we don't produce a greater burden on you or your IT departments. So we want to be very flexible in how you send data to us. So whatever works best. In fact, I have something for one of our partners right here, little 64 gig USB drive, so that you can just download it directly off of the server, off of your computer, and hand it right back to us. So we're very committed to making it as simple and smooth for you as we possibly can. So we purchased our server, we set it up using a virtualized operating system so that we can really create this virtual environment for security, for portability, for if it ever goes down, we can just take that virtual image and put it back up. Gives us a lot of flexibility in how we configure that server. We've created the virtualized machines so that we can have a development environment and a database. So we're basically pretending like our one server is 2 servers. And as we move forward, there will actually be 5 or 6 virtual servers operating on one physical unit. So we're trying to be very, very space and cost efficient So we're buying one piece of hardware. We've got one piece of hardware running, cuts down on heating, cooling, temperature, and wear and tear on the computers. And then we also, leveraging off of Todd's experience, created a very integrated development environment using the Atlassian software, so that everything from functional requirements through issue tracking, through collaboration of all the different developers working on the project, to code quality and review are all integrated in the same system, so that I can give them a functional requirement as an archivist, and they can track it all the way through the code to final implementation to say, this is how we made that happen. And so we'll have a very tight environment that will help us make sure that the system does everything that we need it to do and we specified it should do. And that server is all configured and ready, and thanks to DAG's IT, we're going to move it over to Kalani Moku so that it is in a protected, backed up server environment. So we're very excited about getting that moved over. So from a software design, we really recommended that it's built off of that OAIS model, and that we have a 3-tier architecture system for it, so that we can really leverage best practices and create as much security between the different areas as we can, so that researchers use the web tier, but they never see the actual data itself. So that we have to pass it through a series of firewalls to protect that data, so that, again, authenticity is paramount for this repository. Everything that we can do to make sure that those records are trustworthy and documentably trustworthy, we're going to pursue. And as I mentioned, we're virtualizing the environment so it has portability, so that it's hardware agnostic. So if we get new servers, we can move that virtual server very easily. If we wind up needing to get bigger servers, we just pick up that little virtual image and drop it on the new server without having to do a whole lot of configuration. So it makes it a lot easier for us and a lot more extensible. Because if we need more firepower, it's easy to expand that virtual server because it doesn't physically reside anywhere. And the initial recommendation, we looked at a series of existing digital archives, and we made a recommendation that I think this is the way we want to go. So a little bit about OAIS, just so you know. It's a very important standard in the archiving field because it was the first and pretty much the only standard that exists that helps tell us what do you do for a digital archives. And so it provides the methodology framework of how the archives and the records producers interact with each other. And as you can see here, the importance of it is the standard was developed by the National Aeronautic and Space Administration and by the British, Canadian, European, Japanese, and Russian space agencies, because these groups have been producing electronic records longer than most. If you date back to the 60s, NASA actually lost the original footage from the Apollo moon landing. They lost a good chunk of the data from the Viking Mars lander. So they know about these mistakes. They were fortunate in the Apollo 11 that they had distributed copies out to most of the major news houses, and so they were able to get a copy back. But preserving the original digital data has been a huge issue from them, because if you think about it, all of the devices that they send out into space beam a lot of data back. And they've been doing this for the last 50 or 60 years. So they felt the pain, and they said, you know what, we need to do something. We need to create this model that says this is what we need to do going forward. And so in 2003, they actually issued it as an ISO standard reference model saying, if you need to preserve digital records, here are the conceptual things that have to be done. And it also helped delineate for us as archivists what our responsibilities are in a digital realm. And first and foremost, it's to negotiate and accept records from you, the records creators, or as they call them in the standard, producers. To control those records to the level that is necessary for the long term. So not only from a back end, what do we have to do, but also from a user perspective, what information needs to be restricted? Is it the whole record? Or is it just one field of that record that needs to be restricted? And how does that work? And what happens when that restriction is done? Does it automatically revert out? Do you have to get permission? And to talk about some of those things. It also specifies you have to understand who the target audience is. Why are you doing this? What is your ultimate end user, and how are they going to need that information, and how can you give it to them that way? You need to understand that these records have to be independent from the environment which produced them, because this is an archives. We don't have the original system that created the record, and that is okay. Because they are records, they are locked in time. They do not change. They will never be modified. So as an archives, we don't need the original system because we're not going to create new records. That's not our job. We're not going to modify these records because we don't do that. So we need to figure out how can we make these records understandable so that the researcher, the user, can view those records, because they won't have the original software that created the records either. So we have to understand what does that take. And in an ISO 9000 sort of way, for those of you who know that, very critical, follow the documented process. Because if you're going to have authentic records, you have to understand what authenticity means. And you have to be able to document, here is everything we've done to that record, so that I can tell you how it got from A to Z and all the steps in between. And then, of course, well, you have to make the records accessible. Because if you have them, it doesn't do any good if you can't see them. I can preserve the bits. We've preserved the bits on WordStar files. I've got all the ones and zeros. Does anybody speak binary? So you have to make them accessible. It's very important. So OAIS itself is really two separate works. It is the producer-archive interface. So we as an archives and you as a records producer, what is that relationship like? What types of things do we need to exchange? Because it is a partnership. It is an exchange. It's not just you taking records and putting them in the mail or throwing them over the wall and say, here you go, have a nice day. Authenticity. We need to know what those records are. We need to have a negotiation and an understanding. We need to have a memorandum of understanding between your agency and our agency that spells out what your responsibilities are as records creators and our responsibilities are as records preservers, and what type of relationship is that. And then it also provides that reference model that says this is what a digital archives looks like. Here's the needed functions. This is how it operates. Go figure out how to do it in your environment. And interestingly enough, they also acknowledge that this is just the beginning. Technology changes. What we need to do as an archivist and what you're going to need to do as records producers is also going to change with technology. So that in the standard itself, it acknowledges that there's room for more. Particularly as we start to move out, if you can think about cloud technology. So we have a producer archive interface. What about an archive cloud provider interface? Do we do that? What does that take? What are the responsibilities? So it acknowledges that there's a lot of room still for movement and growth. So the Hawaii Digital Archives is going to leverage off of this so that we're going to use the interface methodologies so that we can produce that memorandum of understanding, so that we can do that negotiation to say, here's what we're going to do for you. Here's what we ask from you in return. And document that and write it down so there's no surprises and everything's up front. And then we're going to use that reference model to actually design and build the digital archives. And we'll show you how we're doing that in a little bit. So from a producer archive interface, this is kind of what it looks like. We have the preliminary phase where we say, what are you intending to send to us? Is it on an approved retention schedule? And does that retention schedule say permanent? And if the answer to both of those questions is yes, we're going to say, well, good, send them over. If the answer to either of those questions is no, we're going to say, well, we need to talk. We need to do some more work. We're going to send you over to records management. We're going to try and get them on retention schedules. We're going to see where they fit in that spectrum of how long does it need to be kept. Because we are a digital archives, permanent records only at this point. Because those are the most at risk. Those have the most value. So those are the ones we need to focus on first. So then we go to that formal definition phase where we say, well, what types of records? What do they look like? What are the data fields that you're going to send us? if you're sending us a group of records consistently, what should we expect? Is it a text file and a bunch of TIFF images? Great. We'll configure our system to expect that. So if you wind up sending us a Word document in JPEGs, we're going to go, hey, that's not what we talked about. Our system isn't set up to do that. So we'll do some data validation for you to help make sure that your data is clean and functional and works great. Then you transfer the records to us. We validate those records for content and also conformity, and we send any anomalies back to you. And from my previous experience, this is a great value add that we were able to provide to agencies. So one of the agencies in the state of Washington, that shall remain nameless, produced a huge volume of land records because it was the largest county in the state of Washington. And in the initial data transfer, they sent us some 3 million TIFF images. We found out that 1,500 of them were corrupt and unreadable because we validated those file formats. Those were 1,500 people's land records that could not be read. And so we were able to say, hey, by the way, you may want to go back and check on this. And so they were able to go back to either their backup tapes or the original paper because it hadn't quite been destroyed yet and recreate those 1,500 images. But could you imagine if that was your land record? And, oops, we're so sorry, we can't read it. Are you sure you own this house? Do you have a copy of that somewhere? No, I'm sorry, I had a house fire and I have to prove that it's mine so that I can get insurance. So we want to make sure that that data is prevalent, it is accessible, and it is solid. And then there's the OAIS model. And to me, one of the greatest values as an archivist is we have to look at the 3 major entities that participate in this whole life cycle continuum. And that we have the records creator, which is all of you, the open archival information system, which is us, and then we have this group down here in the lower right corner, the consumers, the researchers, the people that actually need this information and will do something with it. And you see the little bubbles in between. What OAIS provides to us is the producer will submit an information package, a SIP, to the archives. The archives will then do what it needs to do to preserve those records and create an archival information package, which is different than the submission information package because we add information to it. We add authenticity information. We add descriptive information. We add retentioning information into that record that may not have existed when you held it. And then the consumer submits queries to the archives and said, I'd like to look at that record. And what we give to them, what we disseminate in that information package, may not be the same as what the archive stores, which may not be the same as what you sent to the archives. So it's not the exact same record because there's value add, there's metadata, there's restrictions. So it allows us to really conceptualize the fact that that record, although the core of it is the same, what is sent, what is stored, and what is given out to the researchers may not be the exact same content of information. So it talks about ingestion, the process of taking records from the producer and storing them within the archives. And it breaks it down to several steps that helps us define our system around this. So we have to be able to receive a submission package from you somehow. And how do we do that? What does it look like? We've made the choice of not standardizing on any single way to do it. We're not going to dictate to you that you must do it this way, because that we feel is not the best way to do it, because your systems produce records in a given way. Your technology infrastructure can only do so much. And if we tell you you must FTP things to us, well, what if your server isn't set up to FTP? It just doesn't work that way. So we want to be very, very flexible. Be able to take things through file transfer protocols, CDs, backup tapes, hard drives, USB thumbsticks. Any way that you can get it to us, we want to try and help facilitate that process so that it can come. And not only that, but as we receive the records, we want to give you confirmation. We want to follow the paper transmittal process to say, hey, look, we've accepted custody of these records. Here's your receipt. We're now taking control of these. That you have something to know that we've acknowledged we have received it in its entirety. We then want to do quality assurance on that. We want to check those records We want to create some type of checksum or hash value so that we can say without a question that that record has not changed one tiny little bit since you sent it to us. We can validate that absolutely every single 1 and 0 in that record is exactly the way you sent it to us. Authenticity, very paramount. And that it's also in the expected format that you were going to send it to us in, and that the contents of that record are what we expected as well. And then finally, once we've done that, then we start to create that archival package that we will store within the archives itself. That we will follow agreed upon standards, and that we acknowledge that multiple submission packages may be combined into a single archival package, or a single submission package may be broken up into multiple archival packages. So that allows you to bulk up your records and do one transmission rather than having to send each record out one at a time. So again, flexibility is the goal. So once we have it, we're going to create descriptive information to go along with that, so that we can store this information in the database in order to make it more searchable and findable by recording the who, what, where, whens, and whys of those records and exposing those searches to the researchers to be able to find those records. And then leveraging off of our information management experience as archivists and records managers to build finding aids and provide thumbnails of these records to give new ways of accessing those records. Also to work with coordinating updates. So as your records change, what do you do? How do you send it to us? How do we deal with that new material and the new types and the formations and formats that those records will come to us in? And then OAIS talks about archival storage as different from ingestion. So now you've got the records, what do you do with them? What does that look like? What types of services do you have to provide from the storage perspective so that these records are accessible over the long term? And first, you need to receive the data. How do you take those records and move them to a permanent storage area? And do you have some type of hierarchical storage management so that those records that are more in need and more demand, higher demand, are on faster disks, that are more accessible, that are stored in cache, so that when people request them, they get at them very quickly. And those things that are accessed infrequently are on slower, cheaper, higher density disks to really reduce the storage costs that we are going to have. Because storage is cheap, but lots of storage is still very expensive. And there's different levels of storage as well. So how do we do that? How do we confirm where it is and make sure that that record is always traceable? I mean, because has anybody ever put a file somewhere in their desktop folder structure and gone, I'm not quite sure where that went? Yeah, that's really bad when you have 3 million records to have to sort through. You know, doing a keyword search to try and find it again, yeah, it doesn't work so well. And then how do we back up this data and make sure that it's backed up in a way that we can access it and still maintain its authenticity? And how do we deal with that? And then lastly, we're in archives. We're here forever. We're going to outdate technology. We're going to see tons and tons of changes and revisions. So how do we replace the media? How do we plan for that, knowing that every 4 years we're going to need to replace our infrastructure? We're going to need new hard drives, bigger, better, faster. And what does that look like, and how do we manage that seamlessly so we don't have to take the whole system down, upgrade, and then bring it back up? So that's all part of the OAIS storage, along with, again, error checking, make sure the records hasn't changed themselves, to make sure that we have that disaster recovery copy off-site. And not only is it off-site, but we've tested it, so we know there's actually data on there, and we've actually run the drills that we know what happens if the system goes down. How do we bring it back in? Because just having it isn't enough if you don't know how to use it. You don't know what to do with it. And then, you know, there's also the whole concept of, okay, we've got storage. Well, how do we get it out? How do we provide it to the researchers? So we need to address those issues. Then there's the whole management aspect. So how do you administer the database? How do you perform the queries to get the data out? Generate reports so that you as the records producer can say, what do I have in the archives? What have I sent you in the last 6 months? To be able to build these reports and send it out to you. And then the ability to receive updates so that you can add, modify, or delete records out of the system as necessary. These are all functions, it's all footnoted, that we're not going to be putting into this phase, but actually in the next phase. So the first phase is all that implementation and storage aspect. How do we get it in? How do we store it? Then it's, okay, how do we make it better, more manageable, more usable for you? And then moving into, in the third phase, now how do we provide it to the public? Once we've gotten all those kinks out, for us, the main focus is how do we preserve it in perpetuity? Then, once we've done that, how do we expose it to the public? How do we coordinate the access activities so that there's a single user interface for requests, reports, orders for certified copies of records so that we can pass those back to you for fulfillment? How do we generate that dissemination information package and what is contained in it? If we have all of this information, do we provide it to the researcher, or do we give them a small subset of what it is that they need to see? How do we take into account those areas that are restricted? Maybe they can only see the metadata, but not the images itself, because the image has personally identifiable information, social security numbers, signatures, maiden names, whatever, that you tell us we're not comfortable exposing that to the public. How do we negotiate that? And then how do we deliver those to the researcher in a way that they can use them? So if you're using something that is not a standard file format, how do we convert it into something that they can see without having to buy software? Word, for instance. Should we require everybody in the state of Hawaii to have a copy of Word to be able to see government records? Or do we convert it to something like PDF, where there's a free reader that they can use that and be able to access those records? So, given all the OAIS model implementation specifications that we had to look at, the recommendation for the operating environment was to look at 5 current digital archive systems, to evaluate those, and then based on that we made a final recommendation on an open source solution developed out of Canada that is actually in use at the World Bank and the UN. However, once we had our technical staff on board, we did a deeper dive into it and found some areas that we don't think are going to fit very well with the Hawaii environment the way that it is. So we moved on to looking at a couple other systems, including the one that I worked on in Washington State, and also what was being developed at the British Library. We found out that Washington State was very proprietary and very, very expensive. We can't do that. We then looked at the British Library and said, wow, you know, they got this great research project that they've done over 3 or 4 years, spent millions of pounds on, and that would be awesome. I went over there to do research for 2 weeks on it and found out they don't use it. Whoops. So what we've decided to do is leverage off of all 3 of these projects that we've done deep technical dives into, take the best of each of them, and meld them together into a solution that's going to work and work well here. So the solution that we're working on right now is a very heavily documented system design process so that we have all that documentation, so that we have that end-to-end from the functional requirement all the way through the code execution, traceability, so that we can focus on the authenticity aspects, so that we can leverage off of OAIS and make sure that we're doing everything the best that we can. And because we have this integrated development environment, we're storing everything in there. And it's also advantageous that I've talked to some other states and some other entities. They're very interested in what we're doing here. So there's some opportunity that we can share our solution with them, and they can help us develop it as a group. And by doing it in the Atlassian system, which is all very inexpensive or open source software, we can give them the entire development environment, and we can have a much more concerted group effort moving forward. So this is where we're going. This is what we're building for ingestion. And so you can see that ingestion itself has been broken up into 2 parts. On the left, we have the validation, so that we make sure that the records you are sending to us are what we expected and are well formed. And then we process it so that they create archival packages that have authenticity and long-term accessibility built into it. So from the first half, we check what's coming in. We're going to base the ingestion process on a records transmittal plan, which is very similar to the records transmittal process that we do in a paper-based environment. How many people here have actually filled out a transmittal form before? Okay. Well, this will be a new process for a lot of you, but we're going to make it as painless and easy as possible. We're intending to make it at some point an online web form so that you can fill it out all electronically, use a nice little next function, and we'll walk you through it as best we can. So we're going to learn up front what you intend to send to us and how you formatted those records and what type of information is contained with them. We're going to make sure that what you're sending us has been what we've agreed to in advance and signed in our transmittal agreement. And then we're also going to check that what you've sent us is in conformance with file format standards. So we're actually going to check if you send us a PDF, is it a well-formed PDF? Is it a readable PDF? As the example I gave before, if you send us a TIFF, we're going to open it up and say, is it a readable TIFF? So we're going to help you make sure that your files have not been corrupted. We're going to look at it, and if you say, well, we're going to send you a data file, and it has 3 columns. The first one's date, the second one's a number, and the third one's a name. We're going to make sure that indeed everything in the first column's a date, everything in the second column is a number, and everything in the third column is a name. And if it's not, we're going to send it back to you and go, hey, did you know there's some possible data anomalies here, something got cross-wired or what have you, and work with you to make sure that your data is clean. And so the process is going to look like this. So we're going to receive the submission. We're going to make sure that everything you intended to send to us has been received in entirety and accurately. We're going to do what we can to ensure the equality of that transmission, so that we're going to check to make sure that, again, the file formats are good and the data that you said you were going to send to us is in the right format with all the right data columns and all the data in those columns is correct. We're then going to do a series of virus checks on it just to make sure, just to be safe, because if we don't catch it now and it gets in our archives, you know, we potentially have millions or hundreds of millions of records that can be infected. And then we're also going to make sure that we have a backup of what you sent us and we store that off-site. And we're working, hopefully, with one of the agencies, one of the archives on the mainland, to actually send the data off there and have it stored down in their bunker so that it is off island and protected and secured and locked away for a future date if we never need it. So once we've checked it, then we start to bring it in. Then we start to make it archival. So we focus on that we validated it, we bring it in, we do what we need to do so that we can preserve it over the long term. And part of that is identifying what it is and building the migration plan. Because we have to understand the file formats you send us, because they will need to be migrated. It's not a question of if we need to change them, it's a question of when. Because technology changes, software updates come every 3 to 5 years, and so at some point, most commercial vendors only support 3 to 5 versions back. And after that, it's a hands-off process, because technology changes so radically that they do things very, very differently with the newer computing. You know, we're switching now from 32-bit to 64-bit computing. Another 2 or 3 years, we'll be at 128-bit. What happens to some of those old things? What happens to that word start? What happens to that DBase 2? So we have to build those preservation plans in now so that we can get the files out of proprietary file formats into more open standards, things that we feel reasonably assured that we can access and migrate 10 years from now. So we also want to provide permanent links to these records, so persistent IDs, so that when somebody researches them on our website, there's a permanent link that they can use to always go back to that same record, regardless of system upgrades, new storage technologies, software development changes that we do, that record will always have that permanent link that they can go back to. So that is a very important part for us from that authenticity, trust in government, that transparency perspective, that they know once it's in the archives, they know where it is and they can always get back to it. And then we're going to extract whatever metadata we can out of that system. we're building protocols in our side of the processing house that TIFF images, for instance, we're going to try and do full text searches on those. So if you're scanning from paper to electronic, we're going to try and pull as much data out of that as we can. If it is a text-based document like Word, we're going to try and pull all the text out of that as well so that we can do full text indexing on those records so that researchers can enter in a series of keywords and have everything come back to them that hits. So this is what the archival side of the house is going to look like. We're going to create our archival packages. We're going to commit those objects to permanent storage and give them those permanent IDs that will always be associated with them regardless of what the underlying infrastructure looks like. And then we're going to try and enhance that access as much as we can. And part of that is asking you, what features do you think are significant to search on? And making sure that we do what we can to index those fields and make them searchable by the public. So once we've got this all done, the whole point of the prototype phase is to demonstrate the application of this OAIS model into the Hawaii infrastructure. That we can take this reference model and make it work here given the technological infrastructure that we have here in Hawaii. We're going to take the records from different agencies, normalize that data within a preservation-focused environment, and store them within our own database, again, focusing primarily on authenticity and long-term access to these records. We're going to identify what file formats they are and also what versions of file formats they are, so that we as archivists can continually reference, okay, what technology is coming down the line, what program is due for an upgrade, so that we know now may be a time we have to do another migration. That Word 97 is no longer going to be supported in Word 2020. So we need to make sure that any Word 97 documents we have are going to be migrated before 2020 comes out so that we can continue to access those records moving forward. We're going to continue to work on the whole management aspect of the OAIS model, trying to continue to build in, particularly for the records producers, the records creators, access into the administrative side so that you can say, what records do you have? What have I sent you? Can I get a receipt? So that we can make it a more robust and rich experience for you, and it's not just, again, chucking records over the wall going, I have no idea what happened to them. We can continue to build you into a loop and really build that partnership foundation. And then, again, for the next year, move into the pilot phase where we're looking to bring in 3 to 5 new partners and new types of records and new challenges for us to try and figure out solutions moving forward. So from a legislative update, in the archives plan, it was strongly recommended that the state of Hawaii explicitly detail the duties and authorities of the state archivist, which wasn't actually mentioned in the current rule set, so that we can provide the archivist with some documented authority to actually go out and collect these records and to really preserve those records of long-term value, to focus on making that a requirement that, yes, even digital records of permanent value need to be preserved. And so the result of that is we have Senate Bill 997, the Archives Bill, based on the recommendations of the Archive Plan. It clarifies the duties of the state archivist and puts them into law so that they can see to the management of digital archives and protection of electronic records of enduring value, and to establish the State Archives Preservation and Long-Term Access Special Fund. Part of this bill highlights some archival terms which currently were not encoded anywhere, such as enduring value and what does that mean, and also preservation. What does preservation of electronic records mean and what's entailed in that? It also empowers the state archivist to adopt rules as necessary to ensure the acquisition, maintenance, access, and preservation of government records, particularly of electronic form. And again, establishes the special fund and authorizes the state archivist to charge a fee for certain documents filed or registered by the public. And that's currently set at $1 for all recorded documents of permanent value to help fund this project. And the thought behind that was, if they're recorded documents, they're recorded for a very special reason. And that was to make sure that everybody knows from this point forward that somebody has established this right in our society. And so if those records are of permanent value, then it makes sense to have those records help fund their own preservation moving forward. And so far, things are looking good, so we're hoping that that moves forward. So lastly, from a partner update, we classified partners into two specific categories: contributing partners, those that are actually giving records to the archives, and then technology resource partners that we leverage and research with, and we build plans, guidelines, standards with. So the contributing, again, are those that will serve as test beds and will be actively involved throughout the project design and development process. We have two contributing partners that are currently participating in the prototype. We're working closely with their IT department to flesh out this whole concept of a records transmittal plan. What do we need to know from you in order to take those records in and really validate and authenticate those records as trustworthy? So we're starting with data samples, so just give us a small subset of records. Once we've worked that out, then give us the full dump, or if you really want to, just give us the full dump to start, and we're totally fine with that. So we working with the data, getting the data in-house and working that first, and then we're going to work back into, okay, now what type of transfer interface would be most useful in this situation? So how can we automate and make this process as seamless as possible, make it as easy on you, while still maintaining and gathering all that information that we need from an authenticity perspective. And we're also working in very close collaboration with OIMT on some of the initiatives coming out. Particularly, we are very interested in email management, in content management, and some of those initiatives that are coming out statewide that we can really help build in archival sound practices into the creation of a record. So it's not just you create it and at some point you have to decide what to do with it. We'll build that decision making to the extent possible into the actual create new, then it already knows everything that it needs to know. So it'll make life easier for everybody involved. So a few more recommendations that we're still working on. Imaging guidelines for minimum standards, so that those of you who do want to convert paper to electronic, we have those draft guidelines out on the web page right now for the state archives. We're working with some existing agencies to develop best practices. In particular, we're working right now with DHHL on helping them develop an RFP for their conversion of paper to electronic, and so far that's going really well. So, you know, hope that continues. And so we're partnering with agencies and obtaining some copies of some historic records and moving them in-house and under our control. We intend to offer more training because that was something that came out of the records survey, is that you really want more records management and digital records type of training. So we heard you loud and clear. And so we will continue to move down that path and try and make more of that content electronically accessible so that you can view it and read it and study it at your time on your schedule. And then we're also working on more guidelines and best practices along media types and how to do backups and dealing with records management type of issues. So we're hoping over the next 6 to 12 months we'll be able to push more of those out and provide better guidance for you. So where do we go from here? Why did we want to bring all of you together? And it wasn't just to listen to me ramble on for an hour. We're really looking for participants in a stakeholder group. Those of you who are interested in this topic but aren't quite ready to commit, we still need you. We still need your help. In the next 3 to 6 months, we're going to be getting to the point where we're going to start building some of these interfaces. How does an agency transfer records to the archives? We want your feedback. We want your input. We want to know what works for you, because we don't want to spend the next year building a system that we think is the best thing since sliced bread for you to look at and go, oh, that totally doesn't work. That won't serve anybody. So we need your help and your input. So if you're interested in meeting even once for 3 hours or an hour or 20 minutes, please contact Gina, who is in the back here, and let her know that you would like to participate in a stakeholder group. You will see an email invitation coming out later that says we're going to be doing this. Would you be interested? We really want and value your input because it won't succeed if we can't make it work for you. So we're also looking for partners for the next phase in the pilot. And we hopefully will have 2 very good recommendations from our current prototype partner agencies. And so we're, again, looking for 3 to 5 partners moving forward in the next step. The advantage for you is we will help you clean up your house. We will help you organize your digital records and better preserve those of permanent value so that you know that they are being preserved in perpetuity following best practices. We could also use your help voicing support for this project as we continue to move forward with new policies, procedures, and guidelines. And if you are very interested in this, we recommend you start cleaning up your house because, again, we have a June 2014 target date where we will be in full production. And at that point, we'll open the doors to whoever wants to participate. So if you start now, start cleaning up your house, even if you don't want to be in a pilot situation, we can start lining you up for when we go into full production. So there's that opportunity there for you. So whatever level you want to participate in, we really appreciate you being here and learning what we're doing and providing feedback of some of your pain points and how we can help you. So,
would you clarify cleaning your house?
Part of that is organizing your digital material, finding out what you have of permanent value, also going over your current retention schedules. Are all the records that you are creating today on an approved retention schedule? If they're not, in theory, you better not be deleting them because no record can be destroyed in the state unless it's on an approved retention schedule. So making sure that your retention schedules are up to date and actually making sure that you're managing your content according to a retention schedule. That stuff that should be deleted and can be destroyed is gone because all you're doing is creating a bigger headache for your IT department because they have to back up all this stuff. So start managing, and if you don't know how to do that or need some help, to ask us. And then you.
So if you're in the process of trying to migrate from paper copies of letters, for example, that are very, very old, would you recommend, absent some other kind of need to accelerate the migration, would you recommend holding off until you're ready to move forward with this project so that we don't reuse the most efficient, we don't have to duplicate things?
So, for the benefit of recording, let me repeat that. So, for those of you who are looking to move into the conversion of paper to electronic, would we recommend starting now or waiting? The recommendation would probably be to start now because that is a very time-consuming process, but to tie us into the loop because we can have some recommendations on how best to do that. That was one of the things I did in a previous life is I managed the conversion for the Department of Retirement of 24 million documents. So we've got a lot of experience of doing this paper to electronic conversion and what not to do from personal experience. So, so I would start now.
Records retention schedule needs to be updated. What is the process?
So what is the process for updating the retention schedule? Would you like to speak to that, or Carol?
Give records management a call. We're here. If you just Google on State Archives Records Management, you can either send us an email or you can speak with us. 831-6770 is our number. We're more than happy to come to your office and help. Take a look at what you have that may be permanent or non-permanent, either way.
Carol's in charge of records management, so she knows everything you need to know.
What do we do with the hard copy after we scan it?
What do you do with the hard copy after you scan it? That is I'm glad you asked that. That depends on what your paper to digital conversion process looks like. If it is done in an approved method, it is possible to destroy the paper. But you have to have protocols, quality assurance steps in place to ensure that you have accurately captured all the paper into an electronic form.
So you're telling me that electronic can be guaranteed?
Electronic records by law are admissible and substitutable for the paper records. But you have to make sure that the process that you use is accurate. That is the key, because I've seen digital systems where they're not fastidious about confirming that every single page has been accurately imaged and has been accurately reproduced, and then destroying the paper. I've seen systems where they have converted from electronic to paper, or from paper to electronic in a proprietary format, and then the vendor went out of business. So there are certain steps along the way that you have to make sure are done in an open system and an accurate way before you can destroy the paper. It is very achievable, but you have to be very conscientious about what's required in the beginning. And we are working with an agency right now on what that RFP looks like and what that process is going to be. And so part of the output of that will be kind of a best practices. If you want to do this, this is what it looks like. These are the steps you need to do.
And how long do you foresee that process?
Another 3 to 6 months.
Okay. And then you're going to put it out there for others to...
That's the plan. So to me, it's a matter of putting the front end effort into it to ensure, now I've scanned it, do I have every page to image? And so you do literally a page to image verification. You look at the page, you look at the screen. You look at the page, you look at the screen. Is everything there? And it's a very important step, because I've seen these things double feed, I've seen them skip, I've seen images get dropped. And if you don't do that, then you're asking for trouble, because you cannot, here's the record. Well, where's page 2? I don't know. I don't know where it went. So it's just a matter of being very conscientious about what you do and documenting the process.
You know, even if you're concerned about getting rid of your paper, because maybe by law you're required to keep the signature for the life of it or whatever, but put it electronically, you save on research time. When the public says, I want this, you just see the archive. You don't have to physically look for the hard copy anymore.
So the whole paper to image conversion process not only makes you more time efficient, but it also allows you to store that paper, if you choose to keep it, in a more economical way, because you can box them up and literally palletize them and store them, rather than in office space, on folders, on shelves, or in racks. So you can also store them more densely and more inexpensively.
So, is there a deadline by which you need to be ready to move over to archives and start transmitting documents? And because I'm wondering about the interplay between transmission deadlines and determining what's confidential.
So, as far as a deadline on when you have to transfer papers over to the digital archives, or records over to the digital archives, the short answer to that is there is no deadline, because it's not a mandate. You are not required to send records to the digital archives. It's highly recommended, because we're going to be able to preserve those records in ways that your system simply cannot do. And so part of that is we're working on a preservation begins at creation concept, so that the digital archives would prefer to get those records as close to creation as possible. And if we identify ahead of time that there are potential restricted pieces of information in that record, we can sequester that record from public disclosure for a given set of time, because you are also actively managing that record within your own system. So that from a public disclosure perspective, we can send them to you, and you can go through your normal process. But at some point, your active need of that record will no longer be there. And if you know the digital archives already has it, we don't have to negotiate a transfer at that point, because that transfer may be 10 or 15 years down the line, where the technology may have changed sufficiently that it's difficult to migrate that record over at that point in time. Anybody? One digital archivist, no waiting.
My understanding of the previous meetings is that there's also security in terms of, if we were to archive confidential, that it would be restricted versus redacted, so we could solve multiple versions of original document, redacted document, redacted document version number 2, and those would have different security in terms of accessibility.
That is correct. So the concept of when we negotiate that initial records transmittal plan, when you want to send records to us, one of the sections on there is this record restricted? And if so, what parts of it are restricted? Because we build that into the accessibility of that record on the back end. So that we know going into this that, hey, this record, the index is fine, but the image is not. Or half the index is okay, but we have security number here, so we're not going to display that, but we want it in the database so that it's permanently preserved. So those are absolutely part of the requirements of the system, is that we can handle those types of restrictions.
So who retains the right to assert that a document is confidential if we transmit it over to archives?
That's something we ask you to tell us up front. Not only is it confidential, but why. And ideally, we want you to cite the law that applies in this situation so that we can record it into that database so that if we are in turn requested, we can say, well, you need to ask them because it's, according to this, it's restricted. So whenever possible in those types of situations, we want to defer to the originating agency to make that determination. The creator of that record knows that record far better than we ever will.
So I know that you're talking about email and things like that as well.
Yes.
So, conceptually, you could actually have something where, if the email was getting generated and sent to archives, like the press could go request all the emails from so and so, and they would be able to see all of it.
If they are publicly disclosable. It's no different than what it is with the agency right now.
They can do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Go in and request it, just
Absolutely.
now they can't go past 60 days.
Yeah, and that's a huge problem because approved retention schedule. If it's a policy establishing email, it has to be kept forever. And if somebody goes and says, I need that email, you go, oh, I'm sorry, it's been destroyed. The courts will not look very kindly on that.
You know the issue with the state not having enough storage in current policy, so where it goes from numbers is that remains to be.
There's hope on the horizon.
Well, there's funding. It requires funding. I mean, it requires policy change and funding. But without that, currently these two policies are.
Yep. And so that's part of what we're trying to do from an IT perspective is if we know it's permanent, let's get it off of these very expensive production level systems and move it into cold storage, effectively, is what the archives is. Because we are a very simple, focused system. So we can go with cheaper storage and less robust servers because we're not doing that day-to-day production level environment. So we can actually store it cheaper than we could on production level servers. So we're trying to also make it more cost effective in addition to making sure that we're in better compliance and seeing to the long-term preservation of these records.
How is archives going to collect your dollar fee? Is it usually going to be paying a separate dollar amount in addition to the fee that they pay to the agency, or is it going to be substituting the total fee?
So how is the archives going to collect their fee? The intention is it will be an additional dollar onto any recorded document. And how that actual movement of the record from the collecting agency to the archives, I'm not clear on that yet.
Well, first of all, it's not a done deal yet. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with our bill. But yes, the concept is the public would pay the fee, and it would be collected.
Separate dollar amount?
Pardon me?
You want them to pay, write a separate check?
No. They don't have to do that. It could all be the same. The concept is the agency, your agency, who are already collecting fees, would collect this fee as well. But it would be a fee that would come to the special fund for the Digital Archives project. We haven't worked out the processes because we don't even know if it's going to happen yet. We're just hopeful. But that's something that our ASO office would probably work with your ASO office to do, figure out. I don't know anything about how fees are collected, but yeah, there would be some process and probably some cost involved to you, which might come out of that dollar fee. I don't know.
We're working with a vendor to convert our records from paper to electronic. And I don't know if that's what you meant when you were working with that department, but would you be creating something that any state agency could give to a vendor to
say, if you're going to convert records or scan records for the state, you have to do these steps, or something that we could put into our contract. Yeah, we have to have all these terms in the contract, or even a state-approved vendor list. That'd be nice too.
So, if in that whole concept of selecting a vendor to do the paper to electronic conversion, it's our intention to at least have some verbiage that you can put into your RFP to say, we would like to see this. Here's some minimum standards of what we would like to do. Here's what the type of process we would like you to follow, such as the page image verification, double-blind entry, quality assurance, to ensure that the paper that goes in is matched by the electronic record coming out, that the electronic record is at least as of good quality as the paper, if not better, through image enhancement, rotation, and despeckling, and things of that nature. So it won't necessarily be a full RFP, but there will be some pieces to it that you can take from our perspective. The meat of the matter would say, we need to make sure this is done. Anybody else?
At this point, is there any file format standard for the document that we don't be transmitted to the system?
So are there any file format standards that the archives is going to push forth? The answer to that is no. We will have some preferred formats that we like to deal with, but we also recognize that the systems you use are built to do their job. And so we have a hard time rationalizing certain file format requirements, because what if your system doesn't do that? Because a financial system is built to be a financial system. It's not built to produce archival records. And so we have to be very flexible in that. And so we're doing that as a routine, that we feel a vast majority of the records that you produce, we can do something with by migrating it on our side. So rather than requiring you to be able to do that, we're going to build the routines in on our end, because that way we do it in one location rather than having distributed out to 30 or 40 different agencies and say, well, you have to do this. Whenever possible, we want to avoid the have to do this type of scenario, because again, your businesses are built to do your business, not archives. That's what we do. So flexibility is key in the system design.
I'm interested in, you had mentioned that you're going to come up with best practices on when an agency can destroy paper. And I'm wondering if you're going to run it through the appropriate legal entity like the AG's office or something like that, so that we will withstand issues in court, what happened to your paper.
So as far as the when to destroy paper, any guidelines we come out with, we will definitely try and run it past AG. And that was part of what the archives, the electronic record bill also was to help set the stage for that, to say that yes, you can use an electronic copy as the official record, that you're not required to keep the paper forever, because it's very, very expensive to store paper and very bulky, and at some point you have to build a new facility, and that gets to be very expensive.
Movement toward digitizing your information, are your plans for your current physical storage of paper documents going to change?
So is the plan for our current storage of physical paper documents going to change within the archives? What we're hoping is before the archives gets totally full, all of you will be converted to electronic. So we won't have more paper coming in, because the archives is very close to capacity. And again, once the archives is at capacity, we're looking at $30 to $50 million to build a new facility, because archives in particular have very, very special needs, particularly from an HVAC, heating, ventilation, cooling type of scenario, where it has to be very, very stable and both temperature and humidity, which means that the system itself, the HVAC systems, are very, very expensive. So again, hoping that before the archives fills up, we get you all converted over to strictly electronic. Because if you think about it, how many paper documents do you create, paper records, that start out as original paper, not as computer generated, then printed out? So a vast majority of everything that we do in business today starts electronically. So if we can capture that electronically, not only can we reduce the paper burden and the cost of storage, but we can also increase the authenticity and the trustworthiness of those records by capturing it in that electronic format from the system that created it.
So this is maybe it's a strange question coming from a guy who does EGAP, but you've got so many documents, these old documents like the Bureau of Conveyances or the DCCA, like the initial incorporation of the First Hawaiian Bank, or like the logs that they have over at the at BOC, where they're these amazing, they're pieces of art. And so you've got sure you can digitize these and save them, but you're still going to, is there going to be a way to say that there's a reason to keep the physical representation of this particular document there?
So what you're referring to is what we call intrinsic value. That the actual physicality of that record tells us something. And that there has some historical significance. And the answer to that is absolutely. You know, we are historians. We love history at heart. So getting our hold on something from the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, I mean, that's what we live for. And by doing this process, we actually have a better opportunity to preserve those types of records, because by law, we are required to preserve paper records of government. Some of them are extraordinarily boring business records that nobody ever wants to look at, yet we have to keep them. And those take up space. So if we can get them electronically, those boring records that nobody ever wants to look at, yet we're required by law to keep, won't be taking up that storage space. So that when we have the first incorporation papers of the First Hawaiian Bank, we can preserve that bound volume, that we have space to be able to do that. So that those records of intrinsic value have a permanent home, that we can give them the appropriate care and feeding that they need to be preserved over the long term.
Question is, you know, when you're going to get all this information, what do you need in terms of getting all the data schema set up so that the meta tag and all that searchable stuff is really something for the future that the state can all kind of agree on? Is there any help that you need in that area?
So part of that, from our perspective, will definitely be access to directory services, so that we know who created that record, what position were they in, where were they in the organization, and also moving towards cohesive email management and preservation so that we get it directly from the source, and then also content management statewide. You know, as we generate these office documents, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, where are they being stored? How are they being stored? And if we do get that concerted, centralized management system, then we as archivists can say, you know, here is some of the core requirements we need to establish within that system. And to me, that's the most effective way to do it, because otherwise we have an unbelievable amount of subsystems that every agency delivers, and we're very small staff. We can't impact it at that level.
So some policy or some from us would be helpful.
Absolutely. Anyone else? So, stakeholder groups? Anybody? Please email Gina if you have any other questions about digital archiving stuff. I am truly an archives nerd, and I love it. So I'd be happy to geek out with you on that. And I very much appreciate all of you showing up and giving me an hour and a half of your time. So, thank you.